The night was thick with the smell of roasting meat and rich, spiced wine, the kind that made guests laugh too loudly and speak too freely. 12 members of the Walton family, seated around the grand dining table, lifted their glasses in celebration, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond the kitchen door. But before the evening ended, some would choke on their own breath. Others would fall victim to a bitter, unseen end. This is the story of Clara and Mary, twin sisters bound by blood, but not just by love, by a desire for justice. The kitchen had always been their domain, where they learned the art of cooking from the shadows of their master's mansion. But tonight, that same kitchen would become their battleground. Clara stood beside the oven, her hands moving through the motions as she prepared a feast, one that would soon turn into a reckoning for the family that had built their wealth on her suffering. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 7, each chime a slow toll for what was to come. The scent of roasted duck mingled with a hint of something darker, something no one at the table could taste yet. Before we dig into this tale of vengeance, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment, and if stories like this ignite something inside you, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been simmering in silence for far too long. Clara and Mary were born to the whip, to the sweat-soaked earth of the Mississippi plantation, the sounds of it etched into their bones like a second skin. The hot sun would beat down on them as they worked the fields or scurried about in the kitchen, their lives dictated by the whims of their masters. To the Walton family, they were nothing more than bodies, 2 young girls who could cook, who could clean, and who could be worked into exhaustion without question. But Clara and Mary were more than their roles allowed them to be. They were more than the walls that confined them, more than the chains that held their wrists. From the moment they could walk, their bond was forged in silence and secrecy. 2 sisters bound by blood and by an unspoken understanding that their fate would never be their own unless they took it. They grew up in the same room in the quarters, tucked away behind the kitchen in the heart of the plantation. The quarters were small and crude, the walls thin, the roof leaky when it rained. The sisters learned early to share everything. Food, space, dreams. Their mother, an older woman with a face hard from years of suffering, had taught them the most important lesson: never show weakness, never show fear. It would be their only defense in a world that had no mercy for them. By the time they were in their teens, the sisters had become indispensable to the Walton family. Clara, with her steady hands and natural talent for cooking, was often called upon to prepare meals in the house, while Mary was tasked with cleaning, mending, and carrying out the endless chores that kept the plantation running. Both girls were born with a particular gift, an uncanny ability to learn and replicate recipes, to season food to perfection, to make each meal seem like an art form. In a world that had stripped them of everything else, the kitchen was their domain, their kingdom of sorts. But as the years passed, the sisters began to understand that their culinary talents were their only form of currency, and that currency had a price. They had seen the way their masters treated them. Judge Walton, the master of the estate, was a man of considerable wealth, power, and pride. He was a man who valued his possessions above all else, and in his eyes, the sisters were no different from the horses he kept in the stable, useful only as long as they served him. Clara and Mary watched as the Walton family lived in opulence. The house was grand, with marble floors, gold trim, and tapestries that covered the walls like some ornate prison. They could hear the laughter of the family and their guests at dinner parties, the clinking of glasses and the echoes of shallow conversation. The world outside the kitchen was a world of indulgence, of luxury, and it was a world that had no place for them. The Walton family lived like royalty, and their wealth had been built on the backs of people like Clara and Mary. It was on one of these nights, as Clara worked in the kitchen, her fingers deftly slicing through vegetables for the evening's dinner, that she first saw the true cruelty of their masters. The overseer, a cruel man by the name of Mr. Bryant, had come to the house in a rage. He had just finished whipping one of the field workers for a minor mistake and was drunk on power, his fists clenched tight as he entered the house. Without warning, he turned to Clara, who had been setting the table in the adjacent room. "The kitchen is too damn quiet, girl," he sneered. Do you know what happens when the kitchen gets quiet? Clara lowered her head, the old instinct to stay invisible kicking in. But the sight of the blood on Mr. Bryant's hands made her stomach turn. She had been warned before about being too visible, too noticeable, but Clara couldn't stay silent this time. "I don't know, sir," she replied quietly, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear that churned in her gut. Mr. Bryant sneered again, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know, huh? Well, you better get back to work, or I'll remind you how quick a little fire can start." That night, after the overseer left, Clara couldn't shake the image of the blood-stained shirt that had clung to his chest. She had seen it too many times, the brutality that the masters inflicted on the slaves, not just physically but mentally. It was a constant reminder that they were never safe, never truly free. It didn't matter that they worked tirelessly to feed the family, to cook their meals, to keep them comfortable. In the end, they were just tools. As the months passed, the sisters began to feel the weight of the cruelty around them in ways they hadn't before. The master's temper had become more volatile, and the overseers had grown bolder with their punishments. The fire of rebellion started to burn in Clara and Mary's hearts, and they knew, deep down, that the only way they would ever be free would be to take back what was rightfully theirs. The days that followed the overseer's confrontation were filled with a new, quiet tension. It was as if the air itself had thickened, a heavy, invisible weight pressing down on Clara and Mary. They could feel the changes within themselves, the slow, steady shift from passive submission to a quiet kind of defiance. They had seen the cruelty before, had witnessed the broken bodies and weary spirits of those around them. But this time, something inside them had snapped. They could no longer pretend they were helpless. Clara's hands still worked diligently in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring pots with the same precision she had honed over the years. She knew how to season the perfect pot roast, how to craft a stew that would make Judge Walton's guests sing her praises. But now, every cut of the knife, every stir of the spoon, carried with it the weight of a darker purpose. She and Mary had begun to share whispers, those quiet conversations in the dead of night, when the house had settled into an uneasy silence. They would talk of freedom, of the world beyond the plantation's borders, of the possibility that one day they could escape the hell they had been forced to live in. But Clara had come to realize that freedom could not be handed to them. It was a bitter lesson, one that was hard to swallow after so many years of silence. Their mother had taught them to stay quiet, to endure the brutality without protest, but Clara knew better now. The time for quiet endurance had passed. They could no longer wait for the impossible dream of freedom to fall into their laps. They had to take it. In the evenings, when the family sat around their dinner table, Clara would stand in the kitchen, listening to their laughter and conversation. The sounds of the Walton family's indulgence echoed through the walls. Their voices, smooth and polished, spoke of money, of status, of a world they would never let the sisters into. Clara hated them. She hated them for their ignorance, for their ease in a world built on the backs of people like her. But it wasn't just the Walton family she hated. It was the system that had taught her and Mary to serve, to smile and nod, to work until their hands bled and their backs broke, all for a family who would never see them as human. That was the true cruelty, the idea that they were mere tools to be used and discarded when the time came. But Clara and Mary were no longer willing to accept this. One evening, as Clara prepared the evening meal, her thoughts drifted back to Ruth, the elderly housekeeper who had long been a silent witness to the suffering on the plantation. Ruth had always been there, her back bent by years of hard labor, her hands gnarled from the same work the sisters did. Yet, despite her age, Ruth had never lost the sharpness of her mind. She had quietly taken Clara and Mary under her wing, teaching them the art of surviving in the shadows, of using their positions to their advantage. It was Ruth who had first introduced Clara to the old herb book, hidden beneath the floorboards of the kitchen, where the Walton family could never find it. Ruth had kept a collection of recipes not for food, but for remedies that could heal wounds or kill. Ruth had taught Clara how to extract poison from certain herbs, how to prepare it in a way that wouldn't be detected by even the most discerning eye. It was a lesson that had left Clara both intrigued and horrified. "This world, child," Ruth had said one day, her voice low and grave. "It will break you if you let it. But sometimes, the only way to survive is to fight back. You don't have to be big to make a difference. Sometimes, it's the smallest thing that has the biggest impact." In Wilhelm, Clara's mind had lingered on Ruth's words ever since. The small things. The things no one would notice until it was too late. It was in those small moments, those seemingly insignificant acts, that she saw the key to their survival. It wasn't just about serving meals, about cooking perfect dishes. It was about what those dishes could become. The idea took root slowly, like a seed buried deep in the soil, but the more Clara thought about it, the clearer it became. They could use their position in the kitchen to strike back. They could use the very tools they were given to feed the family to destroy them. Mary, who had always been quieter, had begun to see the potential in Clara's plan. They would start small. They would test it first, see if they could slip something into a dish that would make their masters sick, but not too sick, not enough to immediately cause suspicion. The idea wasn't to kill them outright. No, the idea was to make them feel what they had made others feel: helpless, trapped, weak. The sisters began experimenting with the herbs Ruth had introduced to them, testing small doses of poison in the food they prepared. It was a slow, careful process. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Each evening, after the Walton family had finished their meals, Clara and Mary would share a quiet, knowing look. They could feel the tension building. The family was consuming the poison, and although the symptoms hadn't been severe, it was only a matter of time before the effects would be felt. The power, for the first time in their lives, was in their hands. The quiet defiance that had been growing inside Clara for years was beginning to take shape. She no longer feared the masters. She no longer feared the overseers. The fire inside her was growing stronger, and the time to act was drawing near. She would not stand by and watch the Walton family live in luxury while her people suffered. She would make them pay for every whip, every lash, every moment of cruelty they had inflicted on the enslaved. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she stirred the pot on the stove. The time was coming, and the sisters had only one chance to get it right. The heat of the Mississippi sun had begun to wane, but the fire inside Clara and Mary had only grown. The air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of simmering stews and roasting meat, the same smells that had filled the Walton household for years. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, the kitchen was their sanctuary, the place where they could speak freely, where they could share their thoughts without fear of being overheard. As Clara worked, her hands moving with the practiced skill of years spent preparing meals for the family, Mary sat at the wooden table, her fingers idly tracing the grain of the wood. The weight of the plan they had set in motion seemed to settle on them both. There was no turning back now. The sisters knew that their act of rebellion would change everything, not just for the Walton family, but for them, too. It was a dangerous game they were playing, one that could cost them their lives if they failed. They had spent weeks preparing, each night slipping little doses of poison into the food they prepared, testing the limits of the herbs they had gathered from Ruth's secret book. The first few attempts had been small, just enough to make the master and his guests feel slightly ill, to make them uncomfortable without arousing suspicion. But now, as they gathered more potent ingredients, the plan was clear. The entire family would consume a meal that would leave them incapacitated, just long enough for the sisters to make their escape. "What if they don't eat tonight?" Mary asked quietly, her eyes flicking nervously to the window as if expecting someone to walk in. The weight of the plan was beginning to settle on her shoulders, too. Clara didn't look up from her work. "They'll eat. They always eat." Her voice was steady, but there was a new edge to it, one that Mary hadn't heard before. The time for hesitation was over. Clara knew what had to be done, and she had no intention of letting fear stand in their way. Mary nodded, though her hand still trembled on the table. "And if it goes wrong? If they catch us?" Clara finally looked up, meeting her sister's gaze. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable. They had been through everything together, suffered together, survived together. And now, they would fight together. "Then, we make sure it doesn't. We've been careful, Mary. We've planned every detail. There's no turning back now. Mary swallowed, her throat dry. But what if there are no what ifs? Clara cut in, her voice hardening. We're doing this. For us. For everyone we've lost. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the soft clink of utensils and the simmering sound of food cooking. But beneath the surface, Clara could feel the rising tide of fear and excitement that had been building for days. The fire was almost at their fingertips, and in that moment, Clara knew they had the power to burn everything down. They had carefully chosen the night for their plan, the night when the Walton family would gather to celebrate Judge Walton's birthday. It was a grand event, one that would be filled with guests and laughter, with wine flowing freely, and people so distracted by their own indulgence that they wouldn't notice the subtle shifts happening right under their noses. The perfect night to set their revenge in motion. Ruth had helped with the details. The old woman had been a quiet ally, someone who had seen the cruelty of the Walton family firsthand and understood the pain that had been inflicted on them for years. Ruth had taught Clara and Mary everything they needed to know how to prepare the poison, how to mask its taste, how to make it undetectable. She had shown them how to slip it into the wine, into the sauces, into the food in a way that wouldn't draw suspicion. It was a delicate process, one that required patience and precision, but Clara and Mary were ready. The table will be set just as usual, Clara said, her hands moving steadily as she prepared the final touches for the meal. The guests will come, they'll sit, they'll eat, they'll never suspect a thing. And when it happens, Mary asked. Clara's eyes narrowed, her gaze hardening. When it happens, we leave. We make sure we're gone before anyone can figure it out. We can't afford to hesitate. We'll be free. The sisters worked in silence for a while, the weight of their plan settling over them like a heavy cloak. It was a strange feeling, this mix of dread and exhilaration. They had never been in control before, never had the power to make such a significant choice in their lives. But now, they did. They could change everything. They could make the Walton family feel the suffering they had inflicted for so long. And in the process, they would secure their freedom, their true freedom. The final dish was ready now. Clara could already picture the dining room, the long, polished table, the fine china, the guests seated around it, unaware of what was coming. They would eat, they would laugh, and then they would fall silent, one by one, as the poison slowly took its toll. Clara looked at her sister, her voice softening for the first time in hours. "Are you ready, Mary?" Mary's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but there was no fear now, only resolve. "I'm ready." Clara nodded, turning back to the stove, her hands steady. The night was almost here, and with it, the chance to make their mark on the world. This was more than a meal. It was a message. It was justice. And when it was over, the world would never be the same again. The evening had arrived. Clara stood in the kitchen, her back straight and her hands steady, though her heart pounded with the weight of what was about to unfold. The Walton household had already begun to fill with laughter and the scent of rich wine as the guests arrived, eager to indulge in the decadent feast that Clara had prepared. She could hear the clinking of glasses from the dining room, the soft murmur of conversation, the rustle of silk and fine fabrics brushing against the furniture. Tonight, the world outside the kitchen was alive with the energy of celebration, of privilege, of indulgence. But here, in the shadows of the kitchen, Clara and Mary were preparing for something different, a celebration of their own, albeit one that would come with consequences. Clara had spent hours perfecting every dish. The roasted duck, glazed with a sweet wine reduction, had been infused with just the right amount of poison to make it undetectable, but deadly. The vegetables, crisp and bright, had been dusted with a subtle powder, masked by the cream sauce they drizzled over them. And the birthday cake, the crowning glory of the evening, had been carefully laced with poison, a sweet, creamy layer that would conceal the bitter taste that would soon settle in their mouths. The poison had been chosen for its slow, insidious effect enough to incapacitate, but not immediately. It would take time, a gradual descent into helplessness. The Walton family, oblivious to the impending danger, was seated at the grand dining table. Judge Walton, the patriarch, was already holding court, raising his glass in a toast to the occasion. His voice was deep and confident, and his smile was smug, as it always was when he felt in control of the world around him. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him, her eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a life well lived, one built on the backs of people like Clara and Mary. The guests, the wealthy men and women who had been invited to the birthday celebration, seemed to revel in the extravagance of the evening. They were a blur of fine dresses and tailored suits, their laughter ringing through the walls as they exchanged stories of their latest successes, of the wealth they had amassed. Clara could hear them clearly, and she felt an icy calm settle over her as she thought of the years of suffering they had caused. Tonight, they would not be so smug. Tonight, they would pay. She and Mary had taken care to ensure that their actions would go unnoticed. The plates were served without a hitch. The dishes passed around the table with a practiced grace. Every course was met with praise, the guests oblivious to the fact that each bite they took would soon make them suffer. Clara could hear them complimenting her work, praising the flavors, commenting on the richness of the sauce, the tenderness of the meat. The compliments seemed to mock her, as if they were unaware that the very food they ate was their undoing. But Clara did not let the praise sway her. She had one goal now: to see this plan through to its bitter end. As the evening wore on, the guests grew louder, the wine flowing freely, their laughter becoming a bit more boisterous. Judge Walton, in particular, was becoming more animated, his cheeks flushed from the alcohol, his words slurring slightly as he raised his glass for another toast. To family, to success, to wealth that knows no bounds, he declared, his voice booming. The guests echoed the sentiment, raising their glasses in unison, unaware that the toast they were making was the final one they would ever share. Clara stood in the corner of the kitchen, her back against the wall, her eyes scanning the dining room. She had done it. She had fed them their last meal. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, and Clara could feel the tension building, the moment of reckoning drawing nearer. And then it began. It started with a small cough, almost imperceptible, but enough to break the facade of joviality. One of the guests, Mr. Thompson, a well-dressed businessman who had been sitting across from Judge Walton, shifted in his seat, a frown crossing his face. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, looking confused, and then leaned forward, his hand clutching his stomach. The conversation at the table faltered for a moment, but no one took notice. Not yet. It didn't take long for the first signs to appear. Margaret Walton, who had been sipping her wine delicately, suddenly looked pale, her face flushed, her hands trembling as she set the glass down, her voice shaky as she asked, "Is there something wrong with the wine?" A ripple of concern spread through the guests, but it was too late. The poison had already begun to take hold. Judge Walton, whose own glass had been filled with the same wine, clutched his throat. His voice faltered as he tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to the floor with a crash. His body convulsed, his eyes bulging in horror, as the poison slowly paralyzed him, just as Clara had planned. The guests screamed. Some tried to rush to his side, others stumbled backward in shock, but the damage was done. One by one, they began to collapse, their bodies racked with pain as the poison coursed through their veins. The air was filled with the sound of choking, of gasping breaths, as the Walton family and their guests succumbed to their fate. Clara's heart raced, her pulse quickening as she watched the scene unfold. This was it. The vengeance she had longed for. The family that had tormented them, that had broken their spirits and stolen their freedom, was finally paying the price. The justice that had eluded her for so long had arrived, served on a silver platter. But even as she stood there, watching the chaos unfold, Clara felt no satisfaction. She had wanted this moment for so long, had planned it with such precision, but now that it was happening, she could feel the cold emptiness that came with it. Revenge was never as sweet as it seemed. The fire had been set, and it was burning, but Clara knew that the flames would consume them all, and when the fire was gone, there would be nothing left but ashes. The silence that followed the screams was deafening. It spread like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating, filling the once lively dining room. The sounds of choking, gasping for air, and bodies collapsing to the floor were replaced by an eerie quiet. The Walton family and their guests were now motionless, sprawled across the table and floor, their lives slowly ebbing away, swallowed by the very feast they had so eagerly consumed. Their laughter, their smugness, their sense of superiority, all had been extinguished in an instant. Clara stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her heart hammering in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had done it. She had watched them eat, watched them celebrate, all the while knowing that each bite, each sip, was slowly dragging them toward their end. The sight of them now, writhing on the floor in agony, was not the victory she had imagined. The satisfaction she thought would come with their suffering was absent, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. But she did not have time to dwell on the feeling. She could hear the distant sounds of footsteps in the hallway, frantic calls for help, the desperate attempts to revive those who had already lost their breath. She had planned this night with meticulous care, but it had come at a steep cost, one that would not be easily paid. Mary stood beside her, her eyes wide with horror, her hands shaking at her sides. The realization that their actions had led to this moment seemed to hit her all at once. She had been quiet during the meal, too fearful to show her emotions, but now she couldn't hide the panic in her eyes. "What have we done, Clara?" she whispered, her voice cracking with uncertainty. They're dying." Clara didn't answer immediately. She looked at her sister, her own face hard and cold. She understood the fear that had taken root in Mary's chest. They had planned for the family to suffer, to feel what they had made others feel. But seeing the destruction unfold before them was another matter entirely. They had killed not just the Walton family, but the entire foundation of their lives. The rebellion had come at a steep price. "We did what we had to," Clara replied, her voice low, almost distant. She was trying to convince herself just as much as she was trying to convince Mary. This is what happens when you live in a world built on cruelty and lies. This is what happens when you use people as tools. You reap what you sow. Mary looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. "But they're dead, Clara. We've killed them." Clara's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of her words, the reality of what they had done sinking in. But she also knew that there was no going back. The Walton family had lived above the law for too long, taking everything from them and from the others on the plantation. They had used their wealth and power to bend the world to their will, and now it was over. Their reign was finished. "I know," Clara said softly, "but we don't get to choose how they die. We only get to choose how we live." The silence continued to press down on them as the house grew quieter, the sounds of life fading into the background as the realization of what they had done settled in. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts moving too quickly to catch. She knew they had to leave. Now. There was no time to waste. They couldn't stay in the house any longer. The poison had worked, but the aftermath was only beginning. The authorities would be called soon. They would come, searching for answers, and they would never stop until they found the ones responsible. Clara quickly moved toward the back door of the kitchen, her movements purposeful, her heart still racing. Mary followed her, still in a daze, but Clara could see the determination beginning to harden in her sister's eyes. It was time. They had prepared for this moment for so long, and now it was here. "We need to go," Clara said, her voice sharp now, no room for hesitation. "The longer we stay, the more chance we have of being caught." Mary nodded, but Clara could see that her sister wasn't fully ready to leave behind the life they had known, the life they had shared, even if it had been one of pain and suffering. But Clara was resolute. The fire had started, and now they needed to leave before the flames consumed them too. They moved quickly, passing through the kitchen and out into the back hall. The plantation house, once a symbol of their imprisonment, now felt like a tomb. The grand staircase that had once been a place of pride for the Walton family seemed hollow, as if the very walls were mourning the loss of the lives they had built. Clara could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. This place had been built on the backs of her ancestors, and it would be the last time she ever set foot here. Mary followed her silently, her face pale but determined. Clara knew that their escape would not be easy. The Walton family's allies would be after them soon, and there would be no mercy. But it didn't matter now. They had already made their choice. The back door swung open, and Clara stepped out into the cool night air. The stars above were bright, but they didn't offer comfort. The world was too vast, too uncertain. They had survived one battle, but the war was far from over. "We go south," Clara said. "The river's close. We'll find a boat. After that, we'll get to the Underground Railroad." Mary nodded again, her lips pressed tight, the weight of their choices hanging between them. They had burned the house down, but it was only the beginning. Now, they had to burn their past, too. Clara didn't look back as they moved into the night. She didn't need to. The fire she had set would burn for them all. It would burn until there was nothing left but freedom. The night was cold as they made their way through the dense woods, the path barely visible under the cover of darkness. Clara's feet moved with practiced ease, her steps quiet and deliberate. The oppressive weight of the Walton estate had long been left behind, but it still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the price they had paid to escape. The fire had consumed everything, the mansion, the riches, the lives of the family, but Clara knew that their freedom had come at a steep cost. The price of liberty wasn't always clear until it was paid in full, and they would soon learn the full measure of that price. By the time they reached the riverbank, Clara was exhausted. Her muscles ached from the long journey, her body still tense from the events of the night. The sound of rushing water filled the air, drowning out the distant cries and confusion that still echoed in her mind. She didn't know how far the fire had spread, or how quickly the authorities would come looking for them. All she knew was that they had to keep moving. Mary, who had been silent for most of the journey, finally spoke. "Do you think they'll come after us?" "Number 4. Clara paused at the river's edge, her eyes scanning the water as she caught her breath. The boat would be here soon. One of the Underground Railroad conductors they had arranged to meet. They couldn't stay on the plantation any longer. Not with the fire still raging in the distance. Not with the Walton family's allies no doubt gathering their forces. They would be hunted, no matter how far they ran. But that wasn't something Clara had ever allowed herself to dwell on for long. "We have no choice but to move forward," Clara said softly. "We can't go back. Not now." Mary nodded, though Clara could see the fear still lingering in her eyes. They had survived one battle, but the real journey was just beginning. They were leaving everything behind. Family, home, even the memories of the pain they had endured. And in return, they had gained something far more precious: freedom. But it wasn't a freedom that came easily, and it wasn't one that would be given without a fight. As the boat drew closer, Clara's heart quickened. The familiar face of the conductor, a man she'd never met but had been in contact with through Ruth's network, was a welcome sight in the darkness. He waved them over, his silhouette a dark figure against the dim moonlight. "Get in quickly," he urged as they approached the shore. "It's not safe here." Clara and Mary climbed into the boat, their hearts pounding as they sat down beside the man. He was quiet as he pushed off from the riverbank, his hands steady on the oars. Clara stared ahead, not looking back at the estate, at the ruins of the Walton family's empire, now nothing more than a heap of ash and smoke in the distance. She had burned that world to the ground, and with it, she had set fire to the life she had known. Now, they would ride the current toward something new, something unknown. As they moved further down the river, the mist began to rise, cloaking them in a blanket of fog. The cool, damp air seemed to numb Clara's thoughts as she leaned back against the side of the boat. The rhythm of the oars was steady, and for a moment, she allowed herself to drift, to forget about the danger they were still in. It was a fleeting sense of peace, but it was the first she had felt in a long time. "Where are we going?" Mary asked, her voice still tinged with uncertainty. "North," Clara said simply. "We'll follow the river as far as we can, then make our way to the nearest safe house. From there, we'll move further north, towards freedom." Mary looked down at the water, the soft ripples of the river reflecting the pale light of the moon. "Do you think we'll make it?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She couldn't promise Mary anything, not in a world so filled with danger and uncertainty. All she could do was hold on to the one thing she knew for sure: they had survived. They had burned the past to the ground, and now they had a chance to build something better, They would fight for that chance. They would fight for each other. "We will," Clara said at last, her voice firm. "As long as we keep moving, we will." The boat continued its journey down the river, the sound of the water lapping against the sides of the boat like the steady beat of a drum. It was the sound of change, the sound of a new beginning. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the full weight of the freedom they had fought for, the weight of the future that was just beginning to unfold. But even as they drifted toward the unknown, Clara knew that they were not alone. The legacy of the fire, the vengeance they had served, would follow them wherever they went. It was a fire that would burn forever, lighting the way for others who were willing to take the same risk, willing to fight for the same freedom. The days that followed their escape were filled with uncertainty. Clara and Mary made their way through the Underground Railroad, each step bringing them closer to the freedom they had dreamed of for so long. But the road was long, and the risks were great. There were moments of fear, moments of doubt, but the sisters never stopped moving forward. They had burned their past to the ground, and in doing so, they had set themselves on a path toward a new life. Their story spread across the South, whispered in the quarters and kitchens of other plantations, carried by those who heard of the two sisters who had struck back with the most unexpected weapon food. The fire they had set in the Walton house became a symbol of resistance, a story passed down from one generation to the next. The legacy of Clara and Mary, the twin sisters of Mississippi, was a flame that could not be extinguished. Their story did not end with their escape. It lived on, a beacon for those who dared to fight back against the oppressive system that had held them in chains. And though the sisters eventually found their way to freedom, they knew that the fire they had started would continue to burn long after they were gone.